We're going to talk about 401k plans explained, how to maximize your retirement savings. I'm your host, Henry Yoshida. I'm a senior vice president at retired.com. I previously co-founded our Rocket Dollar division, which is now a part of retired.com with our sister companies Digital Trust and Bitcoin IRA. On myself, I've been a certified financial planner for over 20 years now. I just did my 20th renewal. And I've always worked with tax advantage retirement accounts. So I just live, breathe, and eat these types of accounts. I love to study them. I love to talk to people about them. And just with some of the recent volatility in the market, tariff impositions, potential trade wars, ongoing conflict all over the world, I've actually been reached out to proactively by many friends and contacts and given some thoughts in some online publications for outlets such as CBS News and Kiplinger. So I'm really excited to kind of talk in a very pointed way about 401k plans. So today we're going to talk about 401k plans explained, how to maximize your retirement savings. We should start with what is a 401k and how does it work? So the definition, not very creative, but I'm sort of going to go out on a limb and assume that the IRS is not known for their marketing creativity. The 401k plan is literally named after the IRS section, the IRS code line named 401k. So it is what you would call an employer-sponsored plan. So you can't open one yourself. Your company has to open one for you and allow you to participate. They have arguably of any type of investment account out there, the best tax benefits. They also have a system where many of the companies that offer these 401k plans give you a match to be inside of it. And just because it's hard to get started in these 401ks, more recently in the last 10 to 15 years, the US government's actually passed rules to automatically enroll employees into the 401k plan. So they actually start you, when you start employment with a company, at some point you automatically get entered into this plan, at which point they will start putting some small portion of your salary. So again, tax benefits, employer matching, so free money from your company on top of your salary, and then automated contributions or automated just being able to get into the plan, automated ability to go into investments and put money in on a regular basis through every paycheck of yours. So let's kind of dive in first on that employer matching. So it's obviously the money that you don't want to miss. We could talk a little bit about how that works. So again, a 401k plan is a legal document provided by a section of the IRS tax code. So the way they even explain how this match works, the mechanics of it, is kind of written in the legalese. So I'll give you an example. We match 50% of your contributions up to 6% of your salary deferral in a 401k plan. So what does that mean? It's that for every dollar of money of your salary that you contribute to the 401k plan, your employer will give you 50 cents more on that dollar. So up to 6% of your salary. So let's just say hypothetically that, and I'm going to use round numbers. I know this isn't the average, but let's say you make $100,000 a year in salary and your employer offers a 50% match on up to 10% of that salary. So if they do that and you do the maximum of 10%, then the employer or the company would give you another 5% or $5,000 of 100,000. So hence the term free money. So that 5,000 is additional match or employer contribution money, and it's free and it's on an annual basis and it's codified in the language of the plan and it's there until they make amendments or changes to it. So really it's the part of the 401k that is one of the three pillars of what makes it great, and arguably of the three, maybe the one that makes it the greatest because you have the ability to get free money from your company. And of course, that leads into really how much should you contribute, because at retired.com, our motto and everything that we stand for is how to get you to that stage in your life. You may work in your state of retirement and living off of your investments and the income that it generates, but you may choose not to work at all. And that freedom is what we call retirement. And that's what we do here at retired.com. So there's steps to get to that level, one of which is that you make consistent contributions that we've talked about in previous episodes over a sustained period of time in investments that have a chance to outpace inflation and grow and outpace the value of the dollar over time. How much should you contribute? And then that will lead into how much you can contribute. So I would say at the very least, since we just talked about this segment before, is at least contribute enough to get to the employer match. So don't leave any free money on the table, obviously, but ultimately contribute what you can. And that's a very loose term. So maybe if I define it a little bit, for me, the easiest rule of thumb is to possibly think about saving one dime for every dollar of salary that you earn. So that would be 10%. So it's an easy round number. I understand that most people can't just cold turkey get to that if you haven't been doing it, but maybe try to work up to that amount. So myself personally, I do 15%. That's above what my company at retired.com offers me in the form of a match. But it took many years for me to work up to that level. I wouldn't say that I was able to start from just first job and then immediately doing 15%. But over the years, I've kind of worked my way up to that amount. And it's become pretty normal for me to see that amount going out and just living off of the remainder of my net paycheck. So the ideal goal would be to just max out the contributions, assuming that you're eligible. So there is a limit, as I mentioned before, imposed by the IRS, and it's adjusted every year because they don't want to make it super easy. But for 2025, the year that we're in now, that maximum amount that you contribute into this type of retirement plan is $23,500. So again, not really relevant unless you're someone saving 10% of your salary and you're making $200,000 or more if you're trying to target that 10%. But just know in your head that the maximum amount you can do is $23,500. If you're over the age of 50, the US government actually allows you to do what's called a catch-up contribution, but the government believes it so much that if you're over the age of 50, you can actually do an additional $7,500 on top of the 23.5. So just keep that in mind that you can actually do 31,000 total if you're over the age of 50, and you can do 23,500 in your 401k. But again, I recognize that that is a large percentage of income, even for someone making $100,000 a year. And now that we've kind of covered just over the last few minutes about why the history of the 401k plan, why it's a great plan, and how much you can contribute to it, it begs the question of how should you invest that 401k wisely. One thing about 401ks are that they're relatively limited. So they literally, like a restaurant, when you sit down to eat, they have a menu of what you can buy in terms of investments in the 401k plan. So the typical menu has usually between 15 to 25 different mutual funds inside of a 401k plan. So you're limited to those 15 to 25, but within them, they're typically broadly diversified. They have really just a couple of key different kind, but the easiest one, if you're just afraid to pick your own investments in a 401k, almost all 401ks now in modern times offer what are a set of called target date funds. So target date means that you don't even need to think about how you should be invested or what you should invest in. You literally will pick the fund. It's named after a year at some point in the future, and you pick that year that most closely matches up to your estimated retirement time frame. So if you're going to retire at 65 and the year 2050, for example, is the closest fund that they have. They're usually in 5-year increments, but let's say 2050 in the future is the closest to when you will be 65 years old. If you don't want to make those choices, you could just select that fund and it'll invest across a broad spectrum of funds, and it will make automatic adjustments in terms of the risk exposure and the allocation to what types of asset classes, what types of stocks, bonds, and so forth. It makes those adjustments over time. So what typically happens in a target date fund is that the further you are away from the actual target date of the fund, so let's say if it's 2050 or 2060 or 2070, the further you are away, the more aggressive and the more risk that fund's going to take. So that would come in the form of a higher percentage of stocks. And as you get closer to the target date, it would actually balance itself out and start to invest in more fixed income and bond type of products. So to make sure that you don't have these big drops in your portfolio 3 years before retirement, as an example. So that's an overview of the target date funds, one kind. But staying within that large cap growth asset class. And then they have different funds inside of your 401k that will represent the other asset classes. So mid cap or bonds or international and so forth. So these funds, they're actively managed. You're taking advantage of a professional manager and their analyst team, and they're acumen in selecting great investments to grow your investment funds. But because there's humans involved and there's research and work involved and transactions involved, they tend to have higher expenses relative to an index fund. So index and passive funds, target date funds, if you just want to set it and forget it, that's basically how a 401k is broken down. But that's the decision you'd make after deciding how much you're going to put into the 401k, and that comes in the form of a percentage of your salary. Then number two, how you would allocate the money that you put into the 401k plan and invest within the menu of the options, typically 15 to 25. And you're most likely going to face target date funds, index funds, or actively managed funds would typically be the only three options for those 15 to 25. And then, of course, over time, maybe on an annual basis. So I think about this, my birthday is coming up, but I mentioned this in a previous episode, but I use either my birthday or one of my kids' birthdays as a date to kind of go in and do a little investment spring cleaning, so to speak. So maybe you might want to look at your investments on a annual basis, just in a non-obvious time. So not January 1 or not December 31st, because a lot of movement happens in the market at the beginning and end of a year. And so you pick some sort of random date that's easy for you to remember. And you might want to make sure that if you're not using a target date fund, that your overall allocation to risk or your portfolio's diversification is matched and appropriate for where you are in your stage along the journey to retirement. So, for example, if you're 10 years away from retirement, you may want to taper down the risk exposure of your portfolio. So maybe you don't go 100% into the S&P 500 index growth stock fund, for example, because it's volatile and you're now in the last 10 years until retirement. So again, reviewing those investments, making small adjustments inside, and because it's a tax advantaged account, and we talked about this as well in a prior episode, there's no consequences from a tax standpoint for buying and selling within. So there's no capital gains inside of the account because it's a tax deferred account. That's just one of the biggest mistakes I see, is that people just let these accounts run forever, and they actually don't realize that their allocation is not at all matched with their stage of life and the size of the portfolio. And then unfortunately, even a bigger mistake that sometimes I see too is that people get very excited. They join a 401k plan and they start contributing money, but then they realize years later that they actually haven't invested that cash. So that's a big mistake that I see. And this kind of actually leads me to some of the research. I was doing my own personal reading yesterday. One of the second largest 401k provider in the United States is a company called Empower, and they manage the 401k accounts for 19 million employees and tens of thousands of large employers. So they have 19 million people in 401k plans, and they're the second largest provider of retirement 401ks in America. And they just released a study that, due to some of the recent market volatility, they've noticed a significant uptick in their 401k participant account holders who have liquidated out completely from investments and are sitting in cash. So I get that maybe people are a little bit afraid, but pulling everything out in a long-term account and sitting in cash could be very detrimental to the long-term value of your portfolio. So again, I, like everyone else, am totally attuned and understanding that the markets have been volatile, but I don't think in any case in a retirement account that it makes sense to do a complete liquidation out of investments and sit in cash. So I think that you can make a minor adjustment, just like I talked about, to taper down the risk tolerance depending on where you are in that investment and retirement savings journey. But it was a pretty alarming thing to hear that Empower was saying that they've seen a significant uptick in the amount of people across their 19 million account holders in 401ks who have just liquidated completely out and gone to cash. So I would argue that that's a very big mistake at this point. And I'm not going to tell you just to stay the course with exactly what you've been doing, but I would put a caveat in that, which is to review what you have and where you sit with your investments, balance that against like where you are in your retirement and investment savings journey, make adjustments accordingly. So a little bit longer of a statement, but much more tactical plan with actionable items. So another question, this is the last part of 401ks, is that, well, Henry, unlike my parents and my parents' parents, I don't really stay at the same job for my entire career. So I have 401ks. I've worked for many companies and they've all offered a 401k, but they've all offered their own 401k. So what do I do when I change jobs, or what do I do if I'm thinking about changing jobs? So um, the last segment here is, what do you do with your 401k when you're changing jobs? Well, there's a couple of options for that. And even back when the 401ks were created in the late 70s and early 80s by Mr. Ted Bana, uh, they had thought about what to do when you change jobs or or need to move 401k plans. So at some point, if you do change jobs, and when this happens, you have a couple of options to you. One option is that you can actually simply leave it with the old employer. So I would argue that that's probably the option when someone doesn't make an option, because if you change jobs but you don't transfer your 401k, it by default stay with the old employer. And I see that quite a bit. So, but some people proactively choose to leave it if it's a great plan with extremely low cost funds, and maybe you just don't have another place to move it to. So option one is leave it with the old employer as you move from job to job to job. But again, it becomes cumbersome and it's a little bit harder for you to tell what your overall picture is and where you might be towards how close you're getting to completing your goals in your retirement account. So option two is you can roll it into an IRA for more investment options. So you could roll it to a company such as ours at retired.com, and that could be done by rolling it to a company such as ours or any number of brokerage houses out there. Option three is that you could take that old retirement plan and move it into your new company 401k plan. And I did want to caveat, since, I think people look to us for guidance, but I think that the most appropriate option is option two. I think you should roll it into an IRA so you control the account. That IRA stays with you regardless of where you go, because it's actually tied to your social security number in the United States. And as you leave a job, you can always roll every 401k from a past job into that IRA. And it's an account that you control. It's an account with virtually unlimited investment options. So it's limited in the sense that if you go to one of the big brokerage houses, it would be limited to stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. But you, instead of purchasing 15 to 25, you could purchase all stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. Now, if you come to retired.com, you open up the world even more. So you'd be able to invest in all private and alternative investments, everything from cryptocurrency on one end of the spectrum to residential real estate, for example, as a rental property on the other. So a lot of flexibility. I'd probably go with option two when you're changing jobs, which would be to open an IRA and roll all old 401ks into that. The way I think about it is that 401ks, the invention and what it's become here in the United States, it's probably the best plan out there. It's the best account that's available for you to save for your retirement. But like anything else, you have to understand what they are, how to put money into them, how to invest that money, and then what to do with those accounts if you actually change jobs and you end up with multiple 401k accounts. We just wanted to, I wouldn't necessarily say demystify, but probably give you a tactical action plan for interacting with your 401ks. So thank you very much for joining us, guys. We'll be back for another episode soon.